Author's note: the stories in this book are all true, but in order to ensure anonymity and protect privacy, we have altered identifying details. The children's names have been changed, as have the names of their adult family members if that information would identify the child. All other adult names are real names, except those identified with an asterisk. Despite these necessary changes, the essential elements of each case are reported as accurately as possible. Conversations, for example, are depicted as recalled and/or as recorded in notes, audio tapes, or video. The sad reality is that these stories are but a tiny percentage of the many we could have told. Over the last 10 years, our clinical group at the Child Trauma Academy has treated more than 100 children who have witnessed the murder of a parent. We have worked with hundreds of children who endured severe early neglect in institutions or at the hands of their parents or guardians. We hope that the strength and spirit of the children whose stories we tell in this book, and the many others who have suffered similar fates, come through on these pages. Introduction. It's hard to imagine today, but when I was in medical school in the early 1980s, researchers didn't pay much attention to the lasting damage that psychological trauma can produce. Even less consideration was given to how trauma might harm children. It wasn't considered relevant. Children were believed to be naturally resilient, with an innate ability to bounce back. When I became a child psychiatrist and neuroscientist, it was not my goal to refute this misguided theory. But then, as a young researcher, I began to observe in the lab that stressful experience, particularly in early life, could change the brains of young animals. Numerous animal studies showed that even seemingly minor stress during infancy could have a permanent impact on the architecture and the chemistry of the brain and, therefore, on behavior. I thought, why wouldn't the same be true for humans? That question became even more salient to me as I began my clinical work with troubled children. I soon found that the vast majority of my patients had lives filled with chaos, neglect, and/or violence. Clearly, these children weren't bouncing back. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been taken to a child psychiatry clinic. They'd suffered trauma, such as being raped or witnessing murder. That would have had most psychiatrists considering the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, had they been adults with psychiatric problems. And yet these children were being treated as though their histories of trauma were irrelevant, and they'd coincidentally developed symptoms, such as depression or attention problems, that often required medication. Of course, the diagnosis of PTSD was only itself introduced into psychiatry in 1980. At first, it was seen as something rare, a condition that only affected a minority of soldiers who had been devastated by combat experiences. But soon the same kinds of symptoms, intrusive thoughts about the traumatic event, flashbacks, disrupted sleep, a sense of unreality, a heightened startle response, extreme anxiety, began to be described in rape survivors, victims of natural disaster, and people who'd had or witnessed life-threatening accidents or injuries. Now the condition is believed to affect at least 7% of all Americans, and most people are familiar with the idea that trauma can have profound and lasting effects. From the horrors of the 9/11 terrorist attacks to the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, we recognize that catastrophic events can leave indelible marks on the mind. We know now, as my research and that of so many others has ultimately shown, that the impact is actually far greater on children than it is on adults. I have made it my life's work to understand how trauma affects children and to develop innovative ways to help them cope with it. I have treated and studied children faced with some of the most horrendous experiences imaginable, from the surviving victims of the Branch Davidian cult conflagration in Waco, Texas, to neglected Eastern European orphans, to genocide survivors. I have also helped courts sort through the wreckage of misguided, satanic ritual abuse prosecutions based on coerced accusations from tortured, terrified children. I have done my best to help children who witnessed their parents' murders, and those who've spent years chained in cages or locked in closets. While most children will never suffer anything as awful as what many of my patients have undergone, it is the rare child who escapes trauma entirely. By conservative estimates, about 40% of American children will have at least one potentially traumatizing experience by age 18. This includes the death of a parent or sibling, ongoing physical abuse and/or neglect, sexual abuse, or the experience of a serious accident, natural disaster, or domestic violence or other violent crime. In 2004 alone, an estimated 3 million official reports of child abuse or neglect were made to government child protection agencies. Around 872,000 of these cases were confirmed. Of course, the true number of abused and neglected children is far higher because most cases are never reported and some genuine cases cannot be sufficiently corroborated for official action to be taken. In one large survey, about 1 in 8 children under the age of 17 reported some form of serious maltreatment by adults within the past year, and about 27% of women and 16% of men report as adults having been sexually victimized during childhood. In a national survey conducted in 1995, 6% of mothers and 3% of fathers even admitted to physically abusing their children at least once. Furthermore, up to 10 million American children are believed to be exposed to domestic violence annually, and 4% of American children under the age of 15 lose a parent to death each year. Also, each year some 800,000 children will spend time in foster care and millions more are victims of natural disasters and devastating automobile accidents. Although I do not mean to imply that all of these children will be severely damaged by these experiences, the most moderate estimates suggest that at any given time, more than 8 million American children suffer from serious, diagnosable, trauma-related psychiatric problems. Millions more experience less serious but still distressing consequences. Roughly 1/3 of children who are abused will have some clear psychological problems as a result, and research continues to show how even seemingly purely physical problems like heart disease, obesity, and cancer can be more likely to affect traumatized children later in their lives. Adults' responses to children during and after traumatic events can make an enormous difference in these eventual outcomes, both for good and for ill. Over the years, research from my lab and many others has produced a much richer understanding of what trauma does to children and how we can help them heal from it. In 1996, I founded the Child Trauma Academy, an interdisciplinary group of professionals dedicated to improving the lives of high-risk children and their families. We continue our clinical work and still have much to learn, but our primary goal is to bring treatments based on the best of our existing knowledge to others. We train people who work with children, whether they are parents or prosecutors, police officers or judges, social workers, physicians, policymakers, or politicians, to understand the most effective ways of minimizing the impact of trauma and maximizing recovery. We consult with government agencies and other groups to help them implement the best practices in dealing with these issues. My colleagues and I travel extensively around the world, speaking to parents, doctors, educators, child protection workers, and law enforcement officials, as well as high-level stakeholders such as legislative bodies or committees and concerned corporate leaders. This book is part of our efforts. In The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog, you'll meet some of the children who taught me the most important lessons about how trauma affects young people. And you'll learn what they need from us, their parents and guardians, their doctors, their government, if they are to build healthy lives. You'll see how traumatic experience marks children, how it affects their personalities and their capacity for physical and emotional growth. You'll meet my first patient, Tina, whose experience of abuse brought home to me the impact of trauma on children's brains. You'll meet a brave little girl named Sandy, who at the age of 3 had to be put in a witness protection program, and who taught me the importance of allowing a child to control aspects of her own therapy. You'll meet an astonishing boy called Justin, who showed me how children can recover from unspeakable deprivation. Each child I've worked with, the Branch Davidian children, who took comfort in caring for each other. Laura, whose body didn't grow until she felt safe and loved. Peter, a Russian orphan whose first-grade classmates became his therapists, helped my colleagues and me place a new piece in the puzzle, allowing us to advance our treatment for traumatized children and their families. Our work brings us into people's lives when they are most desperate, alone, sad, afraid, and wounded. But for the most part, the stories you'll read here are success stories. Stories of hope, survival, triumph. Surprisingly, it is often when wandering through the emotional carnage left by the worst of humankind that we find the best of humanity as well. Ultimately, what determines how children survive trauma, physically, emotionally, or psychologically, is whether the people around them, particularly the adults they should be able to trust and rely upon, stand by them with love, support, and encouragement. Fire can warm or consume, water can quench or drown, wind can caress or cut. And so it is with human relationships. We can both create and destroy, nurture and terrorize, traumatize and heal each other. In this book, you will read about remarkable children whose stories can help us better understand the nature and power of human relationships. Although many of these boys and girls have had experiences far more extreme than most families will encounter, and thank goodness for that, their stories carry lessons for all parents that can help their children cope with the inevitable stresses and strains of life. Working with traumatized and maltreated children has also made me think carefully about the nature of humankind and the difference between humankind and humanity. Not all humans are humane. A human being has to learn how to become humane. That process, and how it can sometimes go terribly wrong, is another aspect of what this book is about. The stories here explore the conditions necessary for the development of empathy, and those that are likely, instead, to produce cruelty and indifference. They reveal how children's brains grow and are molded by the people around them. They also expose how ignorance, poverty, violence, sexual abuse, chaos, and neglect can wreak havoc upon growing brains and nascent personalities. I have long been interested in understanding human development, and especially in trying to figure out why some people grow up to be productive, responsible, and kind human beings, whereas others respond to abuse by inflicting more of it on others. My work has revealed to me a great deal about moral development, about the roots of evil and how genetic tendencies and environmental influences can shape critical decisions, which in turn affect later choices and, ultimately, who we turn out to be. I do not believe in the abuse excuse for violent or hurtful behavior, but I have found that there are complex interactions beginning in early childhood that affect our ability to envision choices, and that may later limit our ability to make the best decisions. My work has taken me to the intersection of mind and brain, to the place where we make choices and experience influences that determine whether or not we become humane and truly human. The boy who was raised as a dog shares some of what I've learned there. Despite their pain and fear, the children in this book, and many others like them, have shown great courage and humanity, and they give me hope. From them I have learned much about loss, love, and healing. The core lessons these children have taught me are relevant for us all. Because in order to understand trauma, we need to understand memory. In order to appreciate how children heal, we need to understand how they learn to love, how they cope with challenge, how stress affects them. And by recognizing the destructive impact that violence and threat can have on the capacity to love and work, we can come to better understand ourselves and to nurture the people in our lives, especially the children. Chapter 1. Tina's World. Tina was my first child patient, just 7 years old when I met her. She sat in the waiting room of the University of Chicago Child Psychiatry Clinic, tiny and fragile, huddled with her mother and siblings, unsure what to expect from her new doctor. As I led her to my office and shut the door, it was hard to tell which one of us was more nervous. The 3-foot-tall African-American girl with meticulously neat braids or the 6'2" white guy with the long mane of unruly curls. Tina sat on my couch for a minute, checking me out, looking me up and down. Then, she walked across the room, crawled into my lap and snuggled in. I was touched. Gosh, what a nice thing to do. What a sweet child. Stupid me. She shifted slightly and moved her hand to my crotch and tried to open my zipper. I was no longer anxious. Now I was sad. I took her hand, moved it from my thighs, and carefully lifted her off my lap. The morning before I first met with Tina, I read through her chart. One small sheet of paper with minimal information taken during a phone interview with our intake worker. Tina lived with her mother, Sarah, and 2 younger siblings. Sarah had called the child psychiatry clinic because her daughter's school had insisted that she get her evaluated. Tina had been aggressive and inappropriate with her classmates. She'd exposed herself, attacked other children, used sexual language, and tried to get them to engage in sex play. She didn't pay attention in class and often refused to follow directions. The most relevant history the chart contained was that Tina had been abused for a 2-year period that started when she was 4 and ended when she was 6. The perpetrator was a 16-year-old boy, her babysitter's son. He had molested both Tina and her younger brother, Michael, while their mother was at work. Tina's mom was single, poor, but no longer on public assistance. At the time, Sarah worked a minimum wage job at a convenience store to support her family. The only childcare she could afford was an informal arrangement with her next-door neighbor. That neighbor, unfortunately, often left the children with her son so she could run errands. And her son was sick. He tied the children up and raped them, sodomized them with foreign objects, and threatened to kill them if they told. Finally, his mother caught him and put a stop to the abuse. Sarah never let her neighbor care for her children again, but the damage had been done. The boy was prosecuted. He went to therapy, not jail. Here we were 1 year later. The daughter had serious problems, the mother had no resources, and I didn't know squat about abused children. Here, let's go color, I said gently as I took her from my lap. She seemed upset. Had she displeased me? Would I get angry? She anxiously studied my face with her dark brown eyes, watching my movements, listening to my voice for some nonverbal cue to help her make sense of this interaction. My behavior didn't fit with her internal catalog of previous experiences with men. She had only known men as sexual predators. No loving father, no supportive grandfather, no kind uncle or protective older brother had touched her life. The only adult males she'd met were her mother's often inappropriate boyfriends and her own abuser. Experience had taught her that men wanted sex, either from her or her mother. So quite logically from her perspective, she assumed that's what I wanted as well. What should I do? How do you change behaviors or beliefs locked into place from years of experience with 1 hour of therapy a week? None of my experience and training had prepared me for this little girl. I didn't understand her. Did she interact with everyone as though they wanted sex from her? Even women and girls? Was this the only way she knew how to make friends? Was her aggressive and impulsive behavior at school related to this? Did she think I was rejecting her? And how might that affect her? It was 1987. I was a fellow in child and adolescent psychiatry at the University of Chicago, just starting the final 2 years of some of the best medical training in the country. I'd had almost a dozen years of postgraduate training. I was an MD, a PhD, and had finished 3 years as a medical and general psychiatry resident. I ran a basic neuroscience research laboratory that studied the stress response systems in the brain. I had learned all about brain cells and brain systems and their complex networks and chemistry. I had spent years trying to understand the human mind. And after all that time, all I could think to do was this. I sat down with Tina at a small table set up in my office and handed her a set of crayons and a coloring book. She opened it up and paged through. "Can I color in this?" she asked softly, clearly unsure what to do in this strange situation. "Sure," I told her. "Should I make her dress blue or red?" I asked Tina. "Red." "Okowo." She held up her colored page for my approval. "Very nice," I said. She smiled. For the next 40 minutes we sat on the floor, side by side, coloring quietly, reaching over to borrow crayons, showing our progress to each other and trying to get used to being in the same space with a stranger. When the session was over, I walked Tina back to the clinic waiting area. Her mother was holding a young infant and talking to her 4-year-old son. Sarah thanked me and we set up another appointment for next week. As they left, I knew I needed to talk to a supervisor with more experience who could help me figure out how to help this little girl. Supervision in mental health training is a misleading term. When I was a medical intern learning to put in a central line, or run a code or draw blood, there were older, more experienced physicians present to instruct, scold, assist, and teach me. I often received immediate, usually negative, feedback. And while it was true that we followed the model watch one, do one, teach one, a more senior, experienced clinician was always close by to help during any interactions with patients. Not so for psychiatry. As a trainee, when I was with a patient or a patient and her family, I was almost always working alone. After meeting with the patient, sometimes multiple times, I discussed the case with my supervisor. During training, a child psychiatry fellow will typically have several supervisors for clinical work. Often I would present the same child or issue to multiple supervisors to gather their different impressions and gain from their multiple, hopefully complementary, insights. It is an interesting process that has some remarkable strengths but also has some clear deficiencies, which I was about to discover. I presented Tina's case to my first supervisor, Dr. Robert Stein I. He was young, serious, intellectual, and in training to become a psychoanalyst. He maintained a full beard and wore what seemed like the exact same outfit every day. A black suit, a black tie, and a white shirt. He seemed a lot smarter than me. He used psychiatric jargon with ease. The maternal introject, object relations, countertransference, oral fixation, and whenever he did, I'd look him in the eyes and try to look appropriately serious and thoughtful, nodding as if what he was saying was clearing things up for me. Ah, yes. Okay. Well, I'll keep that in mind. But really I was thinking, what the hell is he talking about? I gave a short but formal presentation, describing Tina's symptoms, history, family, and the complaints from her school, as well as detailing the key elements of my first visit with her. Dr. Stein took notes. When I finished, he said, "Well, what do you think she has?" I had no clue. "I'm not sure," I stalled. Medical training teaches a young physician to act much less ignorant than he or she really is. And I was ignorant. Dr. Stein sensed this and suggested we use the Diagnostic Guide for Psychiatric Disorders, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, DSM. At that point, it was the DSM-3. Every 10 years or so, it is revised to include updates in research and new ideas about disorders. This process is guided by objective principles but is very susceptible to socio-political and other non-scientific processes. For example, homosexuality was once considered a disorder in the DSM, and now it is not. But the main problem with the DSM to this day is that it is a catalog of disorders based on lists of symptoms. It is kind of like a computer manual written by a committee with no knowledge of the machine's actual hardware or software. A manual that attempts to determine the cause of and cure for the computer's problems by asking you to consider the sounds it makes. As I knew from my own research and training, the systems in that machine, in this case the human brain, are very complex. As a result, it seemed to me that the same output might be caused by any number of different problems within it. But the DSM doesn't account for this. So she is inattentive, a discipline problem, impulsive, non-compliant, defiant, oppositional, and has problems with her peers. She meets diagnostic criteria for attention deficit disorder and oppositional defiant disorder. Dr. Stein prompted. "Yeah, I guess so," I said. But it didn't feel right to me. Tina was experiencing something more or something different than what was described by those diagnostic labels. I knew from my research on the brain that the systems involved in controlling and focusing our attention were especially complex. I also knew that there were many environmental and genetic factors that could influence them. Wasn't labeling Tina defiant misleading, given that her non-compliance was likely a result of her victimization? What about the confusion that made her think that sexual behavior with adults and peers in public is normal? What about her speech and language delays? And if she did have attention deficit disorder (ADD), might the sexual abuse be important in understanding how to treat someone like her? I didn't raise these questions, though. I just looked at Dr. Stein and nodded as if I was absorbing what he was teaching me. Go read up on psychopharmacology for ADD. We can talk more about this next week, he advised. I left Dr. Stein feeling confused and disappointed. Is this what being a child psychiatrist was like? I had been trained as a general adult psychiatrist and was familiar with the limitations of supervision and with the limitations of our diagnostic approach, but I was not at all familiar with the pervasive problems of the children I was seeing. They were socially marginalized, developmentally delayed, profoundly damaged, and sent to our clinic so we could fix things that to me didn't seem fixable with the tools we had at our disposal. How could a few hours a month and a prescription change Tina's outlook and behavior? Did Dr. Stein really believe that Ritalin or some other ADD drug would solve this girl's problems? Fortunately, I had another supervisor as well. A wise and wonderful man, a true giant in the field of psychiatry, Dr. Jarl Dyrud. Like me, he was from North Dakota, and we hit it off immediately. Like Dr. Stein, Dr. Dyrud was trained in the analytic method. Yet he also had years of real-life experience trying to understand and help people. He had let that experience, not just Freud's theories, mold his perspective. He listened carefully as I described Tina. When I finished, he smiled at me and said, "Did you enjoy coloring with her?" I thought for a minute and said, "Yeah, I did." Dr. Dyrud said, "Very nice start. So tell me more." I started to list Tina's symptoms, the complaints the adults had about her behaviors. No. Tell me about her. Not about her symptoms. What do you mean? Where does she live? What is her apartment like? When does she go to sleep? What does she do during the day? Tell me about her. I admitted that I didn't know any of that information. Spend some time getting to know her, not her symptoms. Find out about her life, he advised. For the next few sessions, Tina and I spent time coloring or playing simple games and talking about what she liked to do. When I ask children like Tina what they want to be when they grow up, they often respond with, "If I grow up," because they've seen so much real-life death and violence at home and in their neighborhoods that reaching adulthood seems uncertain. In our conversations, sometimes Tina would tell me that she wanted to be a teacher, and other times she said she wanted to be a hairdresser, all with the perfectly ordinary, rapidly changing desires of a girl of her age. But as we discussed specifics of these various goals, it took some time before I was able to help her recognize that the future can be something you plan for, something you can predict and even change, rather than a series of unforeseen events that just happen to you. I also talked to her mother about her behavior in school and at home and found out more about her life. There was, of course, the daily routine of school. After school, unfortunately, there were often several hours between the time Tina and her younger brother came home and the time Sarah got off from work. Sarah had her children call her to check in, and there were neighbors nearby they could contact in an emergency, but she didn't want to risk more caregiver abuse. So the children stayed home alone, usually watching TV. And sometimes, Sarah admitted, because of what they'd both been through, there was sexualized play. Sarah was far from a neglectful mother, but working to feed 3 young children often left her exhausted, overwhelmed, and demoralized. Any parent would have been hard-pressed to cope with the emotional needs of these traumatized children. The family had little time to play or just be together. As in many financially strapped homes, there was always some pressing need, an economic or medical or emotional emergency that required immediate attention to avoid complete disaster, such as homelessness or job loss or overwhelming debt. As my work with Tina continued, Sarah always smiled when she first saw me. The hour that Tina had therapy was one time in her week when she didn't have to do anything more than be with her other children. Tina would run down to my office while I took a moment to goof with her little brother. He was in therapy as well, but with someone else at a different time, and smile at the baby. When I was sure they were settled in with something to occupy them in the waiting area, I'd rejoin Tina, who would be sitting at her little chair waiting for me. "What should we do today?" she would ask, looking at the games, coloring books and toys she had pulled from my shelves and put on the table. I would pretend to think hard while she'd look at me with anticipation. My eyes would fix on a game on the table and say, "How about let's play Operation?" She would laugh. Yes, she guided our play. I slowly introduced new concepts like waiting and thinking before deciding what to do next. Occasionally, she would spontaneously share some fact or some hope or some fear with me. I would ask questions to get some clarity. Then she would redirect the interaction back to play. And week by week, bit by bit, I got to know Tina. Later that fall, however, Tina was late to therapy for several weeks in a row. Because appointments were only an hour, this sometimes meant we would only have 20 minutes for our sessions. I made the mistake of mentioning this to Dr. Stein during an update on the case. He raised his eyebrows and stared at me. He seemed disappointed. "What do you think is going on here?" "I'm not sure. I think the mom seems pretty overwhelmed. You must interpret the resistance." "Ah, Okowo. What the hell is he talking about? Is he suggesting that Tina doesn't want to come to therapy and is somehow forcing her mother to be late?" "You mean Tina's resistance or the mom's?" I asked. "The mother left these children in harm's way. She may be resentful that this child is getting your attention. She may want her to remain damaged," he said. "Oh," I responded, not sure what to think. I knew that analysts often interpreted lateness to therapy as a sign of resistance to change, but that was beginning to seem absurd, especially in this case. The idea left no room for genuine happenstance and seemed to go out of its way to blame people like Tina's mom, who, as far as I could tell, did everything possible to get help for Tina. It was clearly difficult for her to get to the clinic. To get to the medical center, she had to take 3 different buses, which often ran late during the brutal Chicago winter. She had no childcare, so she had to bring all her children. Sometimes she had to borrow money for the bus fare. It seemed to me she was doing the best she could in an extremely difficult situation. Shortly thereafter, as I left the building one frozen night, I saw Tina and her family waiting for the bus home. They were standing in the dark and snow was slowly falling through the dim light of a nearby streetlight. Sarah was holding the baby and Tina was sitting on the bench next to her brother under the heat lamp of the bus stop. The two siblings sat close to each other, holding hands and slowly rocking their legs back and forth. Their feet didn't reach the ground and they kept time with each other, in sync. It was 6:45, icy cold. They would not be home for another hour at least. I pulled my car over, out of sight, and watched them, hoping the bus would come quickly. I felt guilty watching them from my warm car. I thought I should give them a ride. But the field of psychiatry is very attentive to boundaries. There are supposed to be unbreachable walls between patient and doctor, strict borderlines that clearly define the relationship in lives that often otherwise lack such structure. The rule usually made sense to me, but like many therapeutic notions that had been developed in work with neurotic middle-class adults, it didn't seem to fit here. Finally, the bus came. I felt relieved. The next week, I waited a long time after our session before going to my car. I tried to tell myself that I was doing paperwork, but really I didn't want to see the family standing in the cold again. I couldn't stop wondering about what could be wrong with the simple humane act of giving someone a ride home when it was cold out. Could it really interfere with the therapeutic process? I went back and forth, but my heart kept coming down on the side of kindness. A sincere, kind act, it seemed to me, could have more therapeutic impact than any artificial, emotionally regulated stance that so often characterizes therapy. It was full winter in Chicago now and bitterly, bitterly cold. I ultimately told myself that if I saw the family again, I'd give them a ride. It was the right thing to do. And one night in December as I left work and drove by the bus stop, there they were. I offered them a ride. Sarah declined at first, saying she had to stop at the grocery store on her way. In for a penny, in for a pound, I thought. I offered to drive them to the store. After some more hesitation, she agreed and they all piled into my Toyota Corolla. Miles away from the medical center, Sarah pointed to a corner store and I stopped there. Holding her sleeping baby, she looked at me, unsure whether to take all the children into the store with her. Here, I'll hold the baby. We'll wait here, I said decisively. She was in the store for about 10 minutes. We listened to the radio. Tina sang along with the music. I was just praying the baby wouldn't wake up. I slowly rocked her, mimicking the rhythm that Tina's mother had used. Sarah came out of the store with 2 heavy bags. Take these back there and don't touch anything, she said to Tina, putting the bags on the back seat. When we arrived at her building, I watched as Sarah struggled to get out of the car and walk through the unshoveled snow on the sidewalk, juggling the baby, her purse and a bag of groceries. Tina tried to carry the other bag of groceries, but it was too heavy for her and she slipped in the snow. Opened my door and got out, taking one bag from Tina and the other one from Sarah.
No.
We can manage, she protested. I know you can, but tonight I can help. She looked at me, not sure how to deal with this. I sensed her trying to understand if this was kindness or something sinister. She seemed embarrassed. I felt embarrassed, but it still seemed right to help. We all walked up 3 flights of stairs to their apartment. Tina's mother got out her keys and opened 3 locks, all without disturbing her sleeping baby. How difficult this mother's life was, I thought, all alone caring for 3 children. No money, only episodic and often tedious work. No extended family nearby. I stood at the threshold of the door with the bags in my arms, not wanting to intrude. You can just put those on the table, Sarah said as she walked to the back of the 1-room apartment to put the baby down on a mattress against the wall. In 2 steps, I was at the kitchen table. I put the bags down and glanced around the room. There was one couch facing a color television and a small coffee table with a few cups and dirty dishes on it. On a small table with 3 unmatched chairs near the kitchenette, there was a loaf of Wonder Bread and a jar of peanut butter. One double mattress sat on the floor, with blankets and pillows neatly folded at one end. Clothes and newspapers were scattered around. A picture of Martin Luther King Jr. hung on the wall, and next to it on either side were brightly colored school portraits of Tina and her brother. On another wall hung a picture of Sarah and the baby, slightly crooked. The apartment was warm. Sarah stood and awkwardly said, "Thanks again for the ride." and I assured her it had been no trouble. The moment was very uncomfortable. As I walked out the door and said, "See you all next week," Tina waved. She and her toddler brother were putting the groceries away. They were better behaved than many children I'd seen in much better circumstances. It seemed to me that they had to be. The drive home took me through some of the poorest neighborhoods in Chicago. I felt guilty. Guilty about the luck, the opportunities, the resources, and the gifts I had been given. Guilty about all of the times I had complained about working too much or not getting credit for something I had done. I also felt I knew much more about Tina. She had grown up in a world so very different from mine, and somehow that had to be related to the problems that brought her to see me. I didn't know exactly what it was, but I knew there was something important about how the world she grew up and lived in had shaped her emotional, behavioral, social, and physical health. Afterwards, of course, I was afraid to tell anyone what I'd done, that I'd driven a patient and her family home. Worse yet, that I had stopped at the store on the way and helped bring in some groceries. But part of me didn't care. I knew I'd done the right thing. You just don't let a young mother with 2 young children and a baby stand in the cold like that. I waited 2 weeks and then, when I next met with Dr. Dyrud, I told him. I saw them waiting for a bus and it was cold. So I gave them a ride home, I said nervously, scanning his face for his reaction, just like Tina had done with me. He laughed as I slowly told him about the extent of my transgression. When I'd finished, he clapped his hands together, saying, "Great! We should do a home visit with all of our patients." He smiled and sat back. "Tell me all about it." I was shocked. In an instant, Dr. Dyrud's smile and the delight on his face released me from 2 weeks of nagging guilt. When he asked what I'd learned, I told him that one moment in that tiny apartment had told me more about the challenges facing Tina and her family than I could ever have learned from any on-site session or interview. Later, in that first year of my child psychiatry fellowship, Sarah and her family moved to an apartment closer to the medical center, 1 20-minute bus ride away. The lateness ceased. No more resistance. We continued to meet once a week. Dr. Dyrud's wisdom and mentorship continued to be liberating for me. Like other teachers, clinicians, and researchers who had inspired me, he encouraged exploration, curiosity, and reflection, but, most importantly, gave me the courage to challenge existing beliefs. Taking bits and pieces from each of my mentors, I began to develop a therapeutic approach that sought to explain emotional and behavioral problems as symptoms of dysfunction within the brain. In 1987, child psychiatry had not yet embraced the neurosciences. In fact, the vast expansion of research on the brain and brain development that began in the 1980s and exploded in the 1990s, the decade of the brain, had yet to occur, let alone influence clinical practice. Instead, there was active opposition by many psychologists and psychiatrists to taking a biological perspective on human behavior. Such an approach was considered mechanistic and dehumanizing, as though reducing behavior to biological correlates automatically meant that everything was caused by genes, leaving no room for free will and creativity, and no way to consider environmental factors like poverty. Evolutionary ideas were seen as even worse, as backwards racist and sexist theories that rationalized the status quo and reduced human action to animal drives. Since I was just starting out within child psychiatry, I didn't yet trust my own capacity to think independently, to process and interpret accurately what I was seeing. How could my thoughts about this be right when none of the other established psychiatrists, the stars my mentors, were talking about or teaching about these things? Fortunately, Dr. Dyrud and several of my other mentors encouraged my tendency to fold neuroscience into my clinical thinking about Tina and other patients. What was going on in Tina's brain? What was different about her brain that made her more impulsive and inattentive than other girls her age? What had happened in her rapidly developing brain when she had suffered these abnormal, sexualized experiences as a toddler? Did the stress of poverty affect her? And why did she have speech and language delays? Dr. Dyrud used to point to his head as he said, "The answer is in there somewhere." My introduction to neuroscience had started during my freshman year in college. My first college advisor, Dr. Seymour Levine, a world-famous neuroendocrinologist, had conducted pioneering work on the impact of stress during early life on the development of the brain, which had shaped all of my subsequent thinking. His work helped me see how early influences can literally leave imprints on the brain that last a lifetime. Levine had done a series of experiments examining the development of important stress-related hormone systems in rats. His group's work demonstrated that the biology and function of these important systems could be altered dramatically by brief periods of stress during early life. Biology isn't just genes playing out some unalterable script. It is sensitive to the world around it, as evolutionary theories predicted. In some of the experiments, the duration of the stress was only minutes long, involving just a few moments of human handling of rat pups, baby rats, which is highly stressful for them. But this very brief stressful experience, at a key time in the development of the brain, resulted in alterations in stress hormone systems that lasted into adulthood. From the moment I started my formal education in the field, then, I was aware of the transformative impact of early life experiences. This became a template against which I compared all subsequent concepts. Frequently, while at the lab, my thoughts would turn to Tina and the other children with whom I was working. I would force myself to work the problem. What do I know? What information is missing? Can I see any connections between what was known and what was not known? Was seeing me making any difference in the lives of these children? As I thought about my patients, I also considered their symptoms. Why these particular problems in this particular child? What could help change them? Could their behavior be explained by anything that I and other scientists in my field were learning about how the brain works? For example, could studying the neurobiology of attachment, the connection between parent and child, help solve problems between a mother and her son? Could Freudian ideas like transference, where a patient projects his feelings about his parents into other relationships, particularly the one he has with his therapist, be explained by examining the function of the brain? There had to be some link, I thought. Just because we couldn't describe it or yet understand it, there just had to be a correlation between what went on in the brain and every human phenomenon and symptom. After all, the human brain is the organ that mediates all emotion, thought, and behavior. In contrast to other specialized organs in the human body, such as the heart, lungs, and pancreas, the brain is responsible for thousands of complex functions. When you have a good idea, fall in love, fall down the stairs, gasp when walking upstairs, melt at the smile of your child, laugh at a joke, get hungry and feel full. All of those experiences and all your responses to these experiences are mediated by your brain. So it followed that Tina's struggles with speech and language, attention, impulsivity, healthy relationships, also had to involve her brain. But what part of her brain, and could understanding this help me treat her more effectively? Which of Tina's brain regions, neural networks, neurotransmitter systems were poorly regulated, underdeveloped, or disorganized? And how could this information help me with Tina's therapy? To answer these questions, I had to start with what I already knew. The brain's remarkable functional capabilities come from an equally remarkable set of structures. There are 100 billion neurons, brain cells, and for each neuron there are 10 equally important support cells called glia. During development, from the first stirrings in the womb to early adulthood, all of these complicated cells, and there are many different types, must be organized into specialized networks. This results in countless, intricately interconnected and highly specialized systems. These chains and webs of connected neurons create the varied architecture of the brain. For our purposes, there are 4 major parts of the brain: the brainstem, the diencephalon, the limbic system, and the cortex. The brain is organized from the inside out, like a house with increasingly complicated additions built on an old foundation. The lower and most central regions of the brainstem and the diencephalon are the simplest. They evolved first, and they develop first as a child grows. As you move upward and outward, things get increasingly more complex with the limbic system. The cortex is more intricate still, the crowning achievement of brain architecture. We share similar organization of our lowest brain regions with creatures as primitive as lizards, while the middle regions are similar to those found in mammals like cats and dogs. The outer areas we share only with other primates, like monkeys and the great apes. The most uniquely human part of the brain is the frontal cortex, but even this shares 96% of its organization with that of a chimpanzee. Our 4 brain areas are organized in a hierarchical fashion, bottom to top, inside to outside. A good way to picture it is with a little stack of dollar bills, say 5. Fold them in half, place them on your palm, and make a hitchhiker's fist with your thumb pointing out. Now turn your fist in a thumbs down orientation. Your thumb represents the brainstem, the tip of your thumb being where the spinal cord merges into the brainstem. The fatty part of your thumb would be the diencephalon. The folded dollars inside your fist, covered by your fingers and hand, would be the limbic system, and your fingers and hand, which surround the bills, represent the cortex. When you look at the human brain, the limbic system is completely internal. You cannot see it from the outside, just like those dollar bills. Your little finger, which is now oriented to be the top and front, represents the frontal cortex. While interconnected, each of these four main areas controls a separate set of functions. The brainstem, for example, mediates our core regulatory functions such as body temperature, heart rate, respiration, and blood pressure. The diencephalon and the limbic system handle emotional responses that guide our behavior, like fear, hatred, love, and joy. The very top part of the brain, the cortex, regulates the most complex and highly human functions such as speech and language, abstract thinking, planning, and deliberate decision-making. All of them work in concert like a symphony orchestra, so while there are individualized capacities, no one system is wholly responsible for the sound of the music you actually hear. Tina's symptoms suggested abnormalities in almost all of the parts of her brain. She had sleep and attention problems, brainstem, difficulties with fine motor control and coordination, diencephalon and cortex, clear social and relational delays and deficits, limbic and cortex, and speech and language problems, cortex. This pervasive distribution of problems was a very important clue. My research, and the research of hundreds of others, indicated that all of Tina's problems could be related to one key set of neural systems, the ones involved in helping humans cope with stress and threat. Coincidentally, those were exactly the systems I was studying in the lab. These systems were suspect to me for two main reasons. The first was that myriad studies in humans and animals had documented the role these systems play in arousal, sleep, attention, appetite, mood, impulse regulation. Basically all of the areas in which Tina had major problems. The second reason was that these important networks originate in the lower parts of the brain and send direct connections to all of the other areas of the brain. This architecture allows a unique role for these systems. They are capable of integrating and orchestrating signals and information from all of our senses and throughout the brain. This capacity is necessary to effectively respond to threat. If, for example, a predator may be lurking, an animal needs to be able to respond just as quickly to his scent or sound as to actually seeing him. Additionally, the stress response systems are among only a handful of neural systems in the brain that, if poorly regulated or abnormal, can cause dysfunction in all four of the main brain areas, just like what I was seeing with Tina. The basic neuroscience work I'd been doing for years had involved examining the details of how these systems worked. In the brain, neurons transmit messages from one cell to the next by using chemical messengers called neurotransmitters that are released at specialized neuron-to-neuron connections called synapses. These chemical messengers fit only into certain correctly shaped receptors on the next neuron, in the same way that only the right key will fit into the lock on your front door. Synaptic connections, at once astoundingly complex and yet elegantly simple, create chains of neuron-to-neuron-to-neuron networks that allow all of the many functions of the brain, including thought, feeling, motion, sensation, and perception. This also allows drugs to affect us because most psychoactive medications work like copied keys, fitting into the locks meant to be opened by particular neurotransmitters and fooling the brain into opening or closing their doors. I had done my doctoral research in neuropharmacology in the lab of Dr. David Upperchard, who had trained with Dr. Solomon Snyder, a pioneering neuroscientist and psychiatrist. Dr. Snyder's group was famous for, among many other things, finding the receptor at which opiate drugs like heroin and morphine act. When I worked with Dr. Upperchard, I did research on the norepinephrine, also known as noradrenaline, and epinephrine, also known as adrenaline, systems. These neurotransmitters are involved in stress. The classic fight or flight response begins in a central clump of norepinephrine neurons, known as the locus coeruleus, blue spot, named for its color. These neurons send signals to virtually every other important part of the brain and help it respond to stressful situations. Some of my work with Dr. Upperchard involved two different strains of rats, which are animals of the same species that had some slight genetic differences. These rats looked and acted exactly the same in ordinary situations, but even the most moderate stress would cause one type to break down. Under calm conditions, these rats could learn mazes, but give them the tiniest stress, and they would unravel and forget everything. The other rats were unaffected. When we examined their brains, we found that early in the development of the stress-reactive rats, there was overactivity in their adrenaline and noradrenaline systems. This small change led to a great cascade of abnormalities in receptor number, sensitivity, and function across many brain areas, and ultimately altered their ability to respond properly to stress for a lifetime. I had no evidence that Tina was genetically oversensitive to stress. I did know, however, that the threat and the painful sexual assaults Tina experienced had, no doubt, resulted in repetitive and intense activation of her threat-mediating stress response neural systems. I recalled Levine's work that had shown that just a few minutes of stressful experience early in life could change a rat's stress response forever. Tina's abuse had gone on much longer. She'd been assaulted at least once a week for 2 years, and that had been compounded by the stress of living in a constant state of crisis with a family that was often on the economic edge. It occurred to me that if both genes and environment could produce similar dysfunctional symptoms, the effect of a stressful environment on a person already genetically sensitive to stress would probably be magnified. And as I continued to work both with Tina and in the lab, I came to believe that in Tina's case the repeated activation of her stress response systems from a trauma endured at a young age, when her brain was still developing, had probably caused a cascade of altered receptors, sensitivity, and dysfunction throughout her brain, similar to the one I observed in animal models. Consequently, I started to think Tina's symptoms were the result of developmental trauma. Her attention and impulse problems might be due to a change in the organization of her stress response neural networks, a change that might have once helped her cope with her abuse, but was now causing her aggressive behavior and inattention to her classwork in school. It made sense. A person with an overactive stress system would pay close attention to the faces of people like teachers and classmates, where threat might lurk, but not to benign things like classroom lessons. A heightened awareness of potential threat might also make someone like Tina prone to fighting, as she would be looking everywhere for signs that someone might be about to attack her again, likely causing her to overreact to the smallest potential signals of aggression. This seemed a much more plausible explanation for Tina's problems than assuming that her attention problems were coincidental and unrelated to the abuse. I looked back through her chart and saw that upon her first visit to the clinic her heart rate had been 112 beats per minute. Normal heart rate for a girl of that age should have been below 100. An elevated heart rate can be an indication of a persistently activated stress response, which was more evidence for my idea that her problems were a direct result of her brain's response to the abuse. If I had to give Tina a label now, it wouldn't be ADD, but rather post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Over the 3 years I worked with Tina, I was delighted and relieved by her apparent progress. There were no more reports of inappropriate behavior at school. She was doing her homework, going to class, and no longer fighting with other children. Her speech had improved. Most of her problems had been related to the fact that she was so soft-spoken that teachers, and even her mother, often couldn't hear her well enough to understand her, let alone correct her pronunciation. As she learned to speak up and was spoken to more often, thereby receiving the repeated corrective feedback she needed, she caught up. She had also rapidly become more attentive and less impulsive, so rapidly in fact that I didn't even discuss medication with my supervisors after that initial conversation with Dr. Stein. Tina guided our play during our sessions, but I used every opportunity to teach her lessons that would help her feel more confident out in the world and help her behave more appropriately and rationally. We initially learn impulse control and decision-making from those around us, sometimes from explicit lessons, sometimes by example. Tina, however, lived in an environment where neither explicit or implicit lessons were taught. Everyone around her just reacted to what happened to them, and so that's what she did too. Our meetings offered her the undivided attention she craved, and our games taught her some of the lessons she had missed. For example, when I first began my work with Tina, she hadn't understood the concept of taking turns. She couldn't wait to start things. She acted and reacted without thinking. In the simple games that we played, I modeled more appropriate behavior and repeatedly taught her to pause before doing the first thing that popped into her head. Based on her excellent progress in school, I truly believed I'd helped her. Unfortunately, however, 2 weeks before I left the clinic to start a new job, now 10-year-old Tina was caught performing fellatio on an older boy at school. What I taught her, it seemed, was not to change her behavior, but to better hide her sexualized activity and other problems from adults and to control her impulses in order to avoid getting in trouble. On the surface, she could make others think she was behaving appropriately, but inside, she had not overcome her trauma. I was disappointed and confused upon hearing this news. I had tried so hard, and she had really seemed to be getting better. It was difficult to accept that what seemed to be a positive therapeutic effort had been so hollow. What had happened? Or more importantly, what didn't happen in our work to help change her? I kept thinking about the effects Tina's early childhood trauma and her unstable home life could have had on her brain. And soon I realized that I needed to expand my view of clinical mental health work. The answers to my failed, inefficient treatment for Tina, and to the big questions in child psychiatry, were in how the brain works, how the brain develops, how the brain makes sense of and organizes the world. Not in the brain as it has been caricatured as a rigid, genetically preset system that sometimes requires medication to adjust imbalances, but in the brain in all its complexity. Not in the brain as a seething complex of unconscious resistance and defiance, but in the brain as it evolved to respond to a complex social world. A brain, in short, that had genetic predispositions that were shaped by evolution to be exquisitely sensitive to the people who surrounded it. Tina did learn to better regulate her stress system. Her improved impulse control seemed to be good evidence of this. But Tina's most troubling problems had to do with her distorted and unhealthy sexual behaviors. I realized that some of her symptoms could be fixed by changing her overreactive stress response, yet that would not erase her memory. I began to think that memory was what I needed to understand before I could do better. So what is memory, really? Most of us think about it in relation to names, faces, phone numbers, but it is much more than that. It is a basic property of biological systems. Memory is the capacity to carry forward in time some element of an experience. Even muscles have memory, as you can see by the changes in them that result from exercise. Most importantly, however, memory is what the brain does, how it composes us and allows our past to help determine our future. In no small part, memory makes us who we are, and in Tina's case, her memories of sexual abuse were a large part of what stood in her way. Tina's precocious and over-sexualized interactions with males clearly stemmed from her abuse. I began considering memory and how the brain creates associations when two patterns of neural activity occur simultaneously and repetitively. For example, if the neural activity caused by the visual image of a fire truck and that caused by the sound of a siren co-occur repetitively, these once separate neural chains, visual and sound-related neural networks, will create new synaptic connections and become a single, interconnected network. Once this new set of connections between visual and auditory networks is created, merely stimulating one part of the network, for example, hearing the siren, can actually activate the visual part of the chain, and the person will almost automatically visualize a fire truck. This powerful property of association is a universal feature of the brain. It is through association that we weave all of our incoming sensory signals together: sound, sight, touch, scent, to create the whole person, place, thing, and action. Association allows and underlies both language and memory. Our conscious memory is full of gaps, of course, which is actually a good thing. Our brains filter out the ordinary and expected, which is utterly necessary to allow us to function. When you drive, for example, you rely automatically on your previous experiences with cars and roads. If you had to focus on every aspect of what your senses are taking in, you'd be overwhelmed and would probably crash. As you learn anything, in fact, your brain is constantly checking current experience against stored templates, essentially memory, of previous, similar situations and sensations, asking, is this new? And is this something I need to attend to? So as you move down the road, your brain's motor vestibular system is telling you that you are in a certain position. But your brain is probably not making new memories about that. Your brain has stored in it previous sitting experiences in cars, and the pattern of neural activity associated with that doesn't need to change. There's nothing new. You've been there, done that, it's familiar. This is also why you can drive over large stretches of familiar highways without remembering almost anything at all that you did during the drive. This is important because all of that previously stored experience has laid down the neural networks, the memory template, that you now use to make sense out of any new incoming information. These templates are formed throughout the brain at many different levels, and because information comes in first to the lower, more primitive areas, many are not even accessible to conscious awareness. For example, young Tina almost certainly wasn't aware of the template that guided her interactions with men, and shaped her behavior with me when we first met. Further, all of us have probably had the experience of physically jumping up before we even figured out what it was that startled us in the first place. This happens because our brain's stress response systems carry information about potential threats and are primed to respond to them as quickly as possible, which often means before the cortex can consider what action to take. If, like Tina, we have had highly stressful experiences, reminders of those situations can be similarly powerful and provoke reactions that are similarly driven by unconscious processes. What this also means is that early experiences will necessarily have a far greater impact than later ones. The brain tries to make sense of the world by looking for patterns. When it links coherent, consistently connected patterns together again, it tags them as normal or expected and stops paying conscious attention. So, for example, the very first time you were placed in a sitting position as an infant, you did pay attention to the novel sensations emanating from your buttocks. Your brain learned to sense the pressure associated with sitting normally. You began to sense how to balance your weight to sit upright via your motor vestibular system, and, eventually, you learned to sit. Now, when you sit, unless it's uncomfortable or the seat is unusually textured or shaped or you have some kind of balance disorder, you pay little attention to staying upright or the pressure the seat puts on your rear. When you are driving, it's something you rarely attend to at all. What you do scan the road for is novelty, things that are out of place, such as a truck barreling down the wrong side of the freeway. This is why we offload perceptions of things we consider normal, so that we can rapidly react to things that are aberrant and require immediate attention. Neural systems have evolved to be especially sensitive to novelty, since new experiences usually signal either danger or opportunity. One of the most important characteristics of both memory, neural tissue, and of development, then, is that they all change with patterned, repetitive activity. So, the systems in your brain that get repeatedly activated will change, and the systems in your brain that don't get activated won't change. This use-dependent development is one of the most important properties of neural tissue. It seems like a simple concept, but it has enormous and wide-ranging implications. And understanding this concept, I came to believe, was key to understanding children like Tina. She had developed a very unfortunate set of associations because she was sexually abused so early in life. Her first experiences with men and her teenage male abuser were what shaped her conception of what men are and how to act toward them. Early experiences with those around us mold all of our worldviews. Because of the enormous amount of information the brain is confronted with daily, we must use these patterns to predict what the world is like. If early experiences are aberrant, these predictions may guide our behavior in dysfunctional ways. In Tina's world, males larger than she was were frightening, demanding creatures who forced her or her mother into sex. The scent, sight, and sounds associated with them came together to compose a set of memory templates that she used to make sense of the world. And so, when she came into my office that first time and was alone in the company of an adult male, it was perfectly natural for her to assume that sex was what I wanted as well. When she went to school and exposed herself or tried to engage in sex play with other children, she was modeling what she knew about how to behave. She didn't consciously think about it. It was just a set of behaviors that were part of her toxic associations, her twisted template for sexuality. Unfortunately, with only an hour a week of therapy, it was almost impossible to undo that set of associations. I could model the behavior of a different kind of adult male. I could show her that there were situations where sexual activity was inappropriate and help her learn to resist impulses, but I couldn't, in such a small amount of time, replace the template that had been forged in the fresh tissue of her young brain, that had been burned in with patterned, repetitive early experience. I would need to integrate a lot more about how the human brain works, how the brain changes, and the systems that interact in this learning into my treatments before I could even begin to do better for patients like Tina, patients whose lives and memories had been marred in multiple ways by early trauma.